Hi, thanks everybody for attending our webinar today. I see we've got a fairly good turnout with a truly global audience. Today's discussion will revolve around the popular topic of whether Hong Kong has lost its appeal as a leading business and financial hub. As everybody knows, Hong Kong has had a lot to deal with the last 18 months, including countrywide protest action, COVID-19, the US-China trade war, the new national security laws, as well as Trump ending Hong Kong's special trade status. The real impact of these events on the city are still to be seen. However, Hong Kong has been extremely resilient in dealing with great adversities in the past, and if history is anything to go by, it should not be any different this time around. During all this uncertainty, there continues to be a strong drive to implement the ambitious plans drawn up for the Greater Bay Area, and its goal of building a world-class city cluster across the Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau region. As preferential policies for the region are put in place and barriers are taken down, it is more than just business as usual. By 2030, the region is expected to play a leading role in advanced manufacturing, innovation, shipping, trade, and finance. Now, before we start, just want to give a little background of Sovereign. So Sovereign has been around for more than 32 years. We've got about 20 offices globally with a head office in Gibraltar. And we're founded and still privately owned by Howard Bilton, who is British and who some of you might know very well. We specialize in a wide range of services, but to briefly categorize private client work, corporate services, pensions, and insurance solutions. We currently have about $10 billion in administration, with about 20,000 corporate structures under management, making us probably one of the largest privately owned family offices in the world. Now, the topics for today's webinar, first on would be Padraig Walsh, and I will introduce each of our panelists as we go through the presentation today. So he'll be talking about Hong Kong and its general contribution to the Greater Bay Area. Next up would be Robert Goris, my colleague from our China office. He would talk about the opportunities in China during the current economic circumstance with a specific focus on the Greater Bay Area. Next up would be Mark Schwab. He'll talk about the impact of the US-China tension and what that has on the Chinese companies' capital market strategies going forward. And then last but not least, Veronica Chan. She'll talk about the reciprocal recognition and enforcement of judgments in civil and commercial matters between the courts of the mainland and Hong Kong. We will conclude with a Q&A session. Now, we are covering a lot of topics today, and we are pressed for time. So if we don't get to each and everybody's questions, I will, after the webinar, get back to you personally, so you don't need to worry about that. So being the most open and international city in the Greater Bay Area, Hong Kong is known for its status as an international financial hub with a renowned professional services and cutting-edge technology ecosystem. It is anticipated that the Greater Bay Area will be comparable to Silicon Valley and San Francisco, Greater Tokyo, and New York metropolitan. It will represent one of the largest urban areas, both in size and population. According to Collier's research, the Greater Bay Area economy is expected to reach $3.6 trillion by 2030. Our first panelist is Padraig Walsh. He is the partner in the corporate and commercial practice of the Legal 500 firm Tanner Witt. He focuses on venture capital and related corporate work. He advises on private equity and debt financing matters, and is a specialist in IP licensing, personal data privacy, equity incentive plans, and shareholder disputes. He is also a member of the FinTech Association of Hong Kong, iTech Law, and Privacy Rules. Now, Padraig, can you please share or tell our audience a little bit more of Hong Kong and what it contributes in the context to the Greater Bay Area?
Certainly, thank you, Marcel. Well, if we move to the next slide, what you'll see in the next slide is a description of where the Greater Bay is. One of the things that I think is well worth pointing out is not just the fact of the numbers. But if you look at each of the different municipalities that have been brought in from Guangdong province as part of the 11, the 16 sectors and cities in total that are part of the Greater Bay Initiative, most of those cities have been brought in and included for a specific reason, because of a technology capability or a manufacturing capability that they have, that when integrated and linked with the rest of the cities in the Greater Bay Area, is a situation where you have a full diverse range for a broad range of industries. And at this stage in the Greater Bay Area, it very much is an industries that are on the sophisticated and high end of things, rather than the more traditional and basic forms of manufacturing and technology related work in the past. Now, there are still challenges. I mean, the challenges that you might find are the fact that there are 3 different jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions in those areas, so different rules, different ways of doing so. But what you found, particularly, and it's accelerating, but particularly in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, is that there is a greater convergence and a greater integration, not just in terms of at a political level, but at an operating level. So you'll have businesses that are coming to Hong Kong that will base themselves in Hong Kong, but by virtue of having a management and a design feature here in Hong Kong, but with access to manufacturing, supply chain, and even distribution if they're looking at the China market itself, and they're able to integrate that quite seamlessly and quite effectively between Hong Kong and Guangdong province. So that's to me is the major point. As you'll see on the next slide, the next slide draws out the point that you were making, Marcel, in respect of the numbers. But anything to do with China, when you compare it to other places, they will always have the numbers. The numbers will never really be an issue. What is a difference is really, I would say, the capacity for growth, that there is still capacity there. If you look at the GDP statistics on a per capita basis across Greater Bay and the other 3 areas, what you'll see is that it's not as expensive a place in terms of the cost of labor and so forth, as if you were to compare to, I mean, the obvious one that is skyrocketing is the San Francisco Bay Area. And these are the kinds of things that I think should give people interest and engagement in looking here as a place to set up as a tech hub and so forth. Now, if you move forward to the next slide, what you'll find are the different qualities and areas that really make Hong Kong a good place to set up shop. And it starts, I would say this because I'm a lawyer, I think it still starts with the legal system, that Hong Kong has got a very certain and flexible legal system. So people know that if they're setting up their companies, they're setting up their businesses here, there are ways you can do so that are tried and tested, quite flexible, quite straightforward, and comparable to places like the UK, the US, South Africa, Singapore, other common law-based or just sophisticated economies throughout the world. So when people come to Hong Kong to set up their businesses, they're able to do, by and large, a lot of the things they want to do or that they're able to do in their home jurisdiction. What they might find is that simply by virtue of the freedom within the economy in Hong Kong, that they're able to do it faster and that they're able to do it possibly better in terms of achieving the outcome and timelines that they might be moving towards. But that flexible and certain common law system is really the root of everything in respect of doing business here. What that means is that a range of other people are quite happy to come and work and operate in Hong Kong because they have that stable base to operate in. That's one of the platforms that's allowed Hong Kong to become a financial services center, for instance. It's because the rules, the regulation, the application of those rules is all done in a transparent way where there aren't issues around corruption or there aren't issues about political favoritism. And that's why Hong Kong is an ideal capital raising venue, why it is an ideal place to run M&A, to do deals and so forth, and why you have all that professional network and support coming into Hong Kong to make those kinds of deals happen here and to do those kinds of financing initiatives. That's borne out on the next slide, where we speak about the fact that you'll find basically, in the old days, the saying was is that you could have breakfast, go to the bank, open a bank account, go to your accountant, open a company, and you could basically do your one-day full-stop shop and get yourself set up in a day in Hong Kong. It's with regulation, AML, KYC, it might take a little bit longer than that nowadays. But that culture of a deal culture, get things done, all these service providers you need in order to make that happen, that culture is still very much there. And that is what really drives Hong Kong as being a good place to do business. What you find more and more now is that integration between mainland Chinese businesses and Hong Kong businesses within Hong Kong is growing deeper and stronger. And that's creating its own opportunities and its own direction in terms of being able to do business here. One of the things in terms of my own space, because I cover the technology area, one of the things that is quite nice to see is an openness with the regulators. It's still a very strong and a very firmly regulated jurisdiction, but you'll see, with the Securities and Futures Commission, with the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Insurance Authority, that each of them have got fintech contact points. Basically, people at the end of a phone that you can say, I've got this crazy disruptive idea about doing something, what do you think? And each of those regulators has worked very assiduously in order to build framework regulations that, yes, have the right kind of interest in terms of protection of people using those financial services, but also the freedom to allow innovation to develop. So it hasn't been a let's ban this, let's ban that. So for instance, in certain places, you could even look towards mainland China in this respect, actually, where cryptocurrency was just basically banned because the authorities weren't quite comfortable in terms of how to deal with it. Hong Kong didn't do that. What it did is you can obtain licenses in order to do various aspects of business and financial services around cryptocurrency. So it hasn't been a ban and stop. It's been a how can we foster this in a properly regulated way? And that's a good environment to operate in. Now, if we move on to the next slide, what you'll see are the other kinds of important things that support and help in respect of a jurisdiction. So one is just in terms of the depth of technology within Hong Kong. And there, what you'll see, I mean, Hong Kong and Singapore, actually, in Asia, would be the two leading data center hubs in the region, in Asia. And a lot of that is because of the level of connectivity, the availability of broadband, the way you've got fiber optic cabling that is, in terms of latency and these kinds of issues, particularly if you're doing business with mainland China, a lot of that is cut down by virtue of being in Hong Kong. And that level of tech enablement, just in terms of the hardcore infrastructure, is something that is really quite unparalleled. And then in terms of people coming to Hong Kong to do business here, there's a flexible and facilitative immigration policy, particularly if you've got technical R&D skills, things that are of high value in terms of the value chain. Now, what I'd like to do in respect of technology in particular is briefly touch on the areas of technology that are interesting in Hong Kong. And these are summarized on the next slide, where on one side we have what the Hong Kong government has highlighted as the key areas of technology that they're interested in. And then my own tuppence worth in respect of what really Hong Kong is good at vis-a-vis technology. Sorry, you'll need to move back a slide there, it's to the table. So the particular areas in that the government has proposed, one slide back, please, is they've looked at fintech, biomedicine, AI and robotics, smart city, which is basically IoT, which is Internet of Things, electronics, and clean tech. Some of those may not necessarily take root in Hong Kong, but the government is putting a lot of funding behind it. What really I think does make sense in Hong Kong is yes, fintech makes sense. Why? Because there's a bunch of financial services businesses here. So if you're looking for a beta market in order to see whether or not your technology is going to take root in financial services, Hong Kong is a great place for that because it is a financial services town. Logistics, supply chain tech, for very similar reasons, or e-commerce type platforms, very similar reason. A lot of businesses do their sourcing and run their merchandising operations through a Hong Kong company. And then you've got, the logistics and supply chain that circuits through Hong Kong port in terms of products either going into China or coming out of China. So again, there's already a group of people in Hong Kong, a market that you can sell to. It makes sense. IoT is particularly interesting because of our proximity to Greater Bay Area. It's the fact that you've got the hardware center of the world 30 miles north of us in Shenzhen and in the southern part of Guangdong province. That is the reason why IoT really makes sense here. You could have your management and your design people here in Hong Kong being able to iterate and do product development at a much faster accelerated pace by virtue of the fact that they would also have a base in Shenzhen or in Guangzhou, and they're able to go through that kind of product development phase immensely faster than would be the case if they were based out of Europe or they were based in other parts of the world. Huge advantage there. In terms of the government support, it's one of the best supported jurisdictions in respect of tech support, I think probably globally. I mean, Hong Kong is basically looking at technology and the technology sector as being the future source of jobs for its population. So if you look at there's any number of funding schemes that are available, some directly focused on patents, innovation, and development. But what we've highlighted here are some things that I think resonate in respect of slightly more mature businesses that might be reaching a funding gap. If you look at Series A funding in venture capital, that about 4 or 5 years ago was very much a funding gap in Hong Kong. You could get the early seed stage, you could get the later private equity kind of funding. Series A and Series B funding was an issue. Hong Kong government has stepped in and they will co-fund. They will back up to, the size of the fund or the amount that they've deployed into this is 2 billion. So a significant amount of money. And they will co-fund in that Series A, Series B space in order to help businesses to get through that particular funding gap in the funding cycle. There's an R&D program, which the government has funded, which is specifically looking at R&D projects with a mainland element so that you're partnering with universities in China and you're getting that integration between Hong Kong and China going. On the next slide, we speak a bit about the type of facilities that are available in Hong Kong Science and Technology Park. They run different programs, different kinds of incubation and other development programs according to both the industry sector and the stage of the business. So in that sense, again, quite a significant amount of government funding and government support.
Yeah, and thanks, Padraig. Can you perhaps just quickly touch on the impact the national security laws will have on doing business in Hong Kong, if it's possible, and perhaps just to highlight the specific sectors?
Certainly, yes. It's quite funny. The national security law came into force at the beginning of August. I think it was beginning of August. And then within a week, there were implementing regulations that were announced. And then about a week later, there was a European Court of Justice decision, which has ramifications in respect of data flows for jurisdictions that have national security laws. So it's been quite a busy 6 to 8 weeks in respect of getting our heads around these particular laws. My own view is that in respect of any impact on business, firstly, the impact will primarily be only in those businesses that have information that is in some way relevant to the 4 offenses brought into being under the national security law. And that limits the scope of what it really means for business really, really significantly. So So, I would hazard that if you look at, say, 95% of businesses that are already operating in Hong Kong, they are operating in a way that doesn't raise particular concerns or issues vis-a-vis the national security laws, because they're not funding or they're not active in areas that are offenses under that particular legislation. So it might be slightly different if you're a business that touches on media, or if you're a business that touches on messaging platforms and so forth. But what I wouldn't expect to see would be, financial institutions saying, okay, we'd better close down Hong Kong now and go somewhere else, because there's no reason in a financial services sector, for instance, why they would want to look at a national security law as anything other than another form of law or compliance they need to be aware of in terms of their general business operations. It's not something that is a specific and direct threat. What I find amusing is that the European Court of Justice decision that I mentioned, it's a decision called Schrems 2, and we have a picture of it on the next slide. That particular decision looked at whether or not the data, personal data of data subjects in the EU is less protected by virtue of transfer to the US because of the national security laws of the US. And the EU decided that actually those, the traditional way of relying on the security and protecting the rights of EU data subjects, they struck it down. They said it was invalid. But what you don't see as a consequence there is people saying, well, let's stop doing business with the US. So in some ways, there's an analogy that way. What will happen is, over the course of time, there will be cases that come through, ways that the courts handle things, and ways in which the laws are relied upon and used by the police. And people will get to a level of awareness and comfort with what it really means. Not a time to be making drastic decisions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Porrick. So moving on, the Pearl River Delta region is now the largest urban area in the world with a population of about 70 million people. A current total GDP of about 1.56 trillion US dollars. The Guangdong province alone generates about 14% of China's national GDP, which includes the megacities of Shenzhen and Guangzhou. Next up would be Robert Gores. He's my colleague in our China office. Robert works in our corporate services and China market entry practice, and he advises on corporate strategies for foreign investments into China, as well as outbound. He has a wealth of experience in the China market, and his client portfolio ranges from SMEs to conglomerates. Now, I find that a lot of foreign companies want to tap into the huge Chinese market, but find it very challenging to do so. Robert, can you perhaps share with our audience on why this is so, and whether China is really open for business to the global community?
Yes, thank you very much, Marcel, for giving me the opportunity to talk with you and share my views on this. I think, is China open for business? I think, yes, China is always open for business, but it's always open for businesses in very specific areas. If you look at what China does, it always opens up in areas where they need investment knowledge and where foreign investments or is needed, and where China needs something from foreign investors. If we, for example, look at the region, and I think where Patrick also explained it well, how Hong Kong is positioned and how that can influence the greater region. The overall region is focused on to become a global center, right? A global center for advanced manufacturing, innovation, finance, transport, and logistics. But not everything fits for every client or for every business. You already touched upon the fact that research says it will grow for 3.6 trillion in 2030. That's almost triple what it is now. So this area is very important for the development of China. And I think especially what is important is to understand why is it important in the current situation. Because if you look at where China is now and where the world is now with COVID happening, right? We can all agree that the world is in not the best shape, right? Economic growth will not come from the outside world. But China still needs to develop. So China needs to find ways where to develop. And the good thing is that China has moved away from the export-driven economy to more an internal consumption focus. And I think that's because of the current situation. China will definitely double down on promoting this. And different strategies have already been in place and are getting more important, like the Made in China 2025 or the China Standards 2035 that focuses on 5G, Internet of Things, also what Padre mentioned, artificial intelligence, and also then the focus on the Greater Bay Area. This all comes together to make the Greater Bay Area, I think, the next world Silicon Valley. I think we are all discussing this, and I think the idea on where the world is now and where China is now is that China needs to put even more focus on this area, on the Greater Bay Area, where Hong Kong has an important role to develop its internal economy. But as Patrick also already shared a few of these challenges. Doing business in China is not easy, especially not across 3 different jurisdictions. Taxation and the legal framework are not aligned. And I think data transfer, the rules, I think that shows the complexity where China or where Hong Kong focuses on the personal privacy and individual, and China focuses more on the national security. And I think it's there where businesses need to navigate this correctly. And I agree with Patrick that it's not every business that will be affected by that, but some businesses will, and some businesses will need to think about it. And especially, I think, if you make the jump from Hong Kong towards China, these are things that you do need to care about. If you're mainly focused in Hong Kong, less to worry about. But if you make that bridge, it is very important. And of course, the uncertainty in investments. Not Hong Kong is a great place, very open. China has a little bit more restrictions where foreign companies can invest, and so this is also something that companies need to think about and being able to navigate correctly. I think in that sense, we are, I think, going into the right direction on opening up of China, opening up in certain areas. If you look at the negative lists that was published in June 23rd this year, there's always 2 negative lists, of course, the national negative list and the free trade zone. But I think at this moment they're almost the same. There's not really a big difference between that. But I think it shows really a good trend, and I think that's also where there are opportunities, especially in the Greater Bay Area, especially with Hong Kong being an important place. For example, one of the restrictions that have been removed are in the financial industry. Nowadays, foreign companies can have in the field of security companies, investment funds, non-performing loans, or insurance companies can have a majority ownership in China. And I think where Hong Kong has many of these companies, many foreign companies that are present there, and they can now enter into, I think, the Greater Bay Area. And where Hong Kong still represents like 35% of the equity financing of Chinese firms, having the ability for foreign companies now entering the Chinese market, and that with these restrictions gone, I think it will really boost the Greater Bay Area, and also give Hong Kong still a very important role in the Greater Bay Area. If we then look at more other industries that are interesting, is I think some of the things that Patrick already touched upon. The Hong Kong, the financial hub, Shenzhen, and the other regions are focused on technology, and every region has a little bit of a different focus. But I think automotive, smart robots, virtual reality, basically I think the buzzword is indeed high end, and everything what is smart. I think if it's smart, then I think it has a place in the Greater Bay Area and around Shenzhen. Of course, you do need to be aware that in China, certain areas are open for private investment, certain areas are not open for private investment. Some have many barriers, some have a few barriers. And if you play that well, and if you are a company that is in an area that has few barriers and is open for public investment or foreign investment, I think that is a good step, or that is maybe a good moment to enter, because China will have the growth in the next few years. But of course, if you are in satellite manufacturing, it's still not the right moment to move. So I think it is very important to understand where China is moving, where it wants investment, where it needs foreign investment, and then I think you can have a great opportunity to create a sustainable business here in China. I think that's my view on where the opportunities. I think the easiest opportunities are in China.
Thanks, Robert. It is no secret that the friction between the US and China is at its lowest point in decades. One of many points of contention is the Trump administration's recommendations to ban Chinese companies that do not comply with US accounting standards from listing on the American stock exchanges. These measures were introduced since, according to Trump, the US public accounting were unable to review audits of China-based companies due to certain restrictions imposed by the Chinese government. On this topic, I'd like to introduce you to Mark Schwab. He will be talking about the tension between the US and China at the moment. He is the international partner of the legal 500 firm King, Witt, Mallesons. He specializes in foreign direct investment, mergers and acquisitions, and restructuring in China. His client portfolio ranges from family-owned businesses to Fortune 500 companies. He is also the global co-head of King, Witt, Mallesons consumer practice, where he works with international brands on entry and exit strategies from China. So Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about what impact the new US policy on accounting standards will have on Chinese companies' capital market strategies going forward?
Yeah, thanks for having me here today, Marcel. Am I operating the slide? Sorry, I should have asked that before. Somebody, can we move to the next slide? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I think the thing is, this started with the trade war. It's morphed into a technology war. So the trade war was not really about tariffs for the Americans. And I think the technology war was not really about 5G. And I think what Patrick mentioned also, Robert, China's really taking the lead in a lot of these technologies of the tomorrow, which will be AI, Internet of Things, all these things. And so I think this is the next step, is now this crackdown on listed companies in China. And I don't think it's really about accounting standards, because you might remember back when they had the big case with Sino-Forest, this issue came up back then. So this is an issue which has come up very often, but then it quiets down again. So I think, if we're just for today, most of the stuff we talk about, the US and China friction, it's normally, China's losing on it a bit and Hong Kong is a bit of a loser on it. But on this one, strangely enough, I think Hong Kong will be a big winner, because the capital, which is, the capital will move. And I think a lot of these Chinese companies will be forced to look further afield. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I think, it's a much bigger thing than trade or capital. It seems to me, it's just my own personal opinion, it's really that the US is trying to suppress China as a potential competitor. And so I think, yeah, it just shows the US is trying to decouple itself from China. Whether it's successful or not, I'm not sure, but I think China's too big to, constrain it. So I think it's really for the US what they want to do. So next slide, please. Before I get into the actual details of how it works, just to explain a bit how most of the companies so a lot of Chinese companies have listed on the US stock exchanges, and for many of them, they were operating in interesting, innovative sectors, which were like, Robert mentioned before, China's had a trend of opening up to foreign investment. So a lot of the sectors which were of particular interest are things like telco business, infrastructure, media, education, and these things were quite tightly held in China. So Chinese entrepreneurs, so local Chinese companies would set up a structure which we call a red chip and a VIE, which is it's basically a captive company, and they would actually list an offshore company. So the reason why this is important is it shows that a lot of these companies do have legal weaknesses, even though they've listed. So this is one of the issues, and this is perhaps a vulnerability which they have. So we can move to the next slide, please. So what happened was there was an absolute storm of Chinese companies going abroad. And I think if you think of companies like Alibaba, Weibo, or Baidu, all these companies, and many of them were much earlier, like the Sina, like this used to be called a Sina structure because Sina was one of the first high-level ones to do it. It's obviously an internet company, and so there was a lot of success. And there was, and I think these companies, they were going to America to raise funds because that's where the money was back then. So may I go to the next slide, please? But what happened was, apart from the very big successes, there were quite a lot of scams. Recent ones like Luckin Coffee, but Sino Forest was a very famous one. It was the first one that Muddy Waters got involved in, and then Giga Media also. And it did make some investors a bit worried about this VIE model and the inherent weakness. But happy to respond to questions on it. But I think we can get distracted by that. So I think what we've seen is many of China's best companies list in America, but we've also seen legitimate concerns about some of the other companies that have listed. So next one, please. So I'm assuming that many companies will not be able to meet the American requirements in respect of audit. It is a bit counterintuitive. I would have thought nobody is trying to list in America at the moment if you're a Chinese company, but there are a lot of Chinese companies still trying to list in America and are still preparing. I think these companies are much more global, much more private, and they don't have the same concerns. But if you just look at the scope of companies, there's really 170 companies listed on NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. And this is a market, capitalization. And whenever we're talking about China, we're talking about big numbers, but this is really a big number. This is $1.2 trillion. So there's really a lot of these companies which will be affected. Some will probably toughen out, but I think anybody strategic or anybody that has concerns or anybody state-owned, they will have to do something. Next slide, please. So what do we think is going to happen? These are personal opinions. I think the biggest companies, the most strategic, like there was a recent one, SMIC, which is a semiconductor company, they'll go to the Chinese mainland exchanges and also the new Star Exchange, which I think is actually now catching up to NASDAQ very, very quickly. And I think the thing is, I'm sure the audience here knows it very well, but people in America forget it. Chinese companies were going to America 20 or 30 years ago because that was where the money was to raise capital. I would argue today it's changed. Chinese investors are very keen on Chinese tech. Chinese investors have cash, and that kind of segues into the next point is Hong Kong. And it's not because this is a Hong Kong-centric audience, but I think really a lot of the big ones, will go to China, and some will go to Hong Kong. But then you're going to see tech and education really go to Hong Kong. And like I think Patrick and Robert both said, geography matters. Hong Kong, it's right next to China. I mean, part of China, but right next to it. But it is very international. It has a very international capital market. The people understand it. And I think what we're seeing a little bit is China. I think Hong Kong used to be 20, 30 years ago, a place where international people would come to do business with China. But now we're also seeing Hong Kong's the place where Chinese companies who want to do business internationally will come. And so I think we'll see a lot of companies who would like to have global ambitions. They'll say, look, Hong Kong's good, it's near us, they understand us, but we could use it as a place to be very international. And then just very briefly, and it might be a little bit because I'm actually based in London at the moment, but I think London will be able to pick up some of those smaller companies, and they will be in tech, consumer, education, because these are sectors where London has a reputation and they understand stuff. But I think London will not be able to compete with Hong Kong or with China. I think China will get most, followed by Hong Kong. And then there will be some who might go private. So I think that's what we're expecting, or at least what I'm expecting. So I end it there, Marcel, in the interest of time.
Thanks, Mark. So next up would be Veronica. She is part of the award-winning Legal 500 Tier 1 Band 1 Restructuring and Insolvency team at Tanner DeWitt. She acts and advises on a variety of bankruptcy and insolvency proceedings, including acting for liquidators, receivers, creditors, and directors. She also has considerable experience dealing with cross-border disputes involving Hong Kong and the mainland China. So Veronica will take us through the mutual recognition of enforcement of judgments between mainland China and Hong Kong. So Veronica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcel. Thank you for having me. So let's put up the slides first. Right, so I'm going to share about how the enforcement of judgments works between Hong Kong and the mainland China. As we've talked about the increase of incentive between Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area, there is a need that to have a more effective and efficient mechanism to enforce judgments in the Greater Bay Area and in Hong Kong. So let's have a look at what arrangements we have in Hong Kong. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And then we'll see from the next slide the current arrangement in Hong Kong. On the reciprocal recognition and enforcement of judgments in civil and commercial matters. This has been updated recently, which we'll discuss later in this discussion. So the next slide we will see how this actually works in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So if we move on to the next slide, we can see the current position is that there is an ordinance which enacted in 2008, giving the effect of the choice of court arrangement in the mainland China. And Hong Kong is called the Mainland Judgment Reciprocal Enforcement Ordinance. So the next slide, please. And we probably need to go back a few slides to see the criteria which is needed in Hong Kong to enforce the mainland judgment. The next slide. So the conditions in Hong Kong that needs to be satisfied is that the mainland judgment needs to be final and conclusive. The underlying contract needs to be on a civil or contractual matter, and the judgment itself needs to give a monetary relief. And there has to be an agreement on an exclusive jurisdiction. So what does this term mean? Then we can move on. Okay, there might be some technical issues. So if we move on to the next slide, recent cases, there are some interpretations to these terms. So what does it mean by exclusive jurisdiction? It doesn't mean that there has to be express words saying that this is sole jurisdiction or exclusive jurisdiction. Very often the court will take into account the intention of the parties. So there are more recent cases in Hong Kong which gives such interpretations, looking behind the intention. So if we move on to the next slide. Yes, we'll see the true intention of the parties and the substance of the contract. So moving on to the next slide. So how do we actually enforce it? In Hong Kong, we need to apply for a certificate certifying that this mainland judgment is final and conclusive and enforceable in the mainland China. And then the court will decide whether to register it in Hong Kong or not. So we have a slide on the procedures on how to apply this certificate, which should be next one. All right, so I'm not going to go through all the procedures, but basically we need a certificate from the court saying that this is the final and conclusive judgment. So moving on, I wish to share a recent case, which is relating to Bank of China against Yang Fan. So in that case, Bank of China successfully obtained a judgment against a borrower in the mainland. Well, the borrower defaulted in a loan agreement. So Bank of China sued against the guarantor, which is Yang Fan in mainland China. To support this judgment, Bank of China also applied for an injunction in Hong Kong. So the criteria would be whether the judgment in mainland is final and conclusive. So the court in Hong Kong took a purposive approach and took into account the intention of the parties and ruled that the mainland court had jurisdiction. And they have gone into quite a deep discussion on the interpretation on the Chinese contract and took into account the intention behind. So,
excuse me, Veronica, can you perhaps speak a bit up? Our audience can't really hear. Is there a mic that you can put closer?
Yes, I'm speaking into it, so hopefully it's better now. So okay. There's also a discussion about behind this case is that the legislative intention is not meant to be giving a very technical or cumbersome argument on this registered foreign judgments, but it's meant to be giving a more effective and efficient alternative for the Hong Kong court to enforce the mainland judgments. So if we move on to the next slide. So how do we enforce Hong Kong judgments in mainland? Basically, the requirements are similar. So we also require a certificate. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see some criteria. Also requiring a certificate from the Hong Kong court, certifying that the Hong Kong judgment is enforceable in Hong Kong, and we need to provide a certified copy of the Hong Kong judgment. And then we take this certificate to the mainland court for registration. So basically similar procedures. So now I'm not going to go into each and every step of it. So if we move on to the next step, next slide. So these are the procedures how we obtain a certificate in Hong Kong. So once this is done, then we can move on to the next slide, take it to the mainland court and have it registered. So these are the steps and how we registered a Hong Kong judgment in the mainland. So we can move on to the next slide. So we have seen the current arrangement does pose a little bit of challenges. As we have discussed, the current arrangement only covers monetary relief, and we're still lacking an arrangement between Hong Kong and Macau. But this gives rise to more opportunities as there are growing interaction between all the Greater Bay Area and in Hong Kong. And there's this need of enforcing judgment between these areas. So what we have now is a new arrangement. If we move on to the next slide. Yes, this is the new arrangement signed earlier this year in January, which is not in force yet. So once this is in effect, it will abolish our old arrangements and it will replace our old choice of court arrangement as well. So what does this new arrangement covers? You can see on the next slide. So we've said that the old arrangement, the current arrangement, covers only monetary relief. The new arrangement will also cover non-monetary relief. It will abolish the exclusive jurisdiction clause. So once this is enacted, exclusive jurisdiction clause will be removed, and this will allow simultaneous application of enforcement in both mainland China and in Hong Kong. So if we move on to the next slide. However, although the new arrangement has not been enforced, there might be some concerns, well, not concerns, there's still some issues that may need to be dealt with, including there are certain judgments, for example, on corporate insolvency, debt restructuring, personal insolvency, bankruptcy, some estate probate issues, some matrimonial issues that is not fully covered yet. However, the current Hong Kong court will take will actually assist mainland court judgment by as long as they are consistent with the Hong Kong law. Then usually the Hong Kong court will also give effect to mainland court orders or decisions, even in these areas that might not be covered by the new arrangement. So that's all for me.
And with this new mutual recognition of judgments between Hong Kong and China, do you think this would facilitate business, or it would make business easier in Hong Kong for companies setting up here and they have a dispute in China? You know, would it facilitate the resolution of the dispute a little bit easier, do you think?
Oh, definitely, because this new arrangement will minimize all the risk of what we've discussed about having to have a clause specifically on exclusive jurisdiction, or it will minimize the risk of having parallel proceedings in both China and Hong Kong. So there are more, it's easier and more efficient for business or even individuals when they need to take out a proceedings in relation to the contract they have.
Okay, thanks, Veronica. That was very insightful. Apologies for the technical issues there with your slides. But yeah, we're moving over to the Q&A section, and I've got a question here. I think this would probably be for Mark. So it's with the Shanghai Hong Kong Connect and now the Shanghai London Connect, could that lead to companies reconsidering their listing in the US?
I don't think so. I think those programs, are more limited in scope. Also, what is actually listed on there. But I think, it's much more going to be the Americans bringing in these regulations and essentially pressuring these companies to do something. So I don't think the draw of these Connect programs will be enough. I think it's really going to be America pressure to get out of American stock exchanges for certain companies that will really be the trigger.
Yeah. Don't have any other relevant questions. Robert, did you wanted to add anything to your presentation?
I think a question we still have a lot, right? I think a lot of people are aware or know how to do business in Hong Kong because it's so familiar to foreign investors. But I think still a lot of foreign companies have difficulties in doing business in China. And what is interesting, I think, is that the questions we have on companies that are entering the Chinese markets and having difficulties there have not really changed in the last 10 years. I think maybe 10 years ago, the industries or the companies, the type of companies that asked the questions were different. Now there are questions more on from technology companies and on having how to do business in China, but their challenges are mainly the same. Still in China, the problem of transparency of the law, language, culture, having everything is in Mandarin and your services are in Mandarin. So a lot of, I think, making the step from Hong Kong into mainland China is not only a step because of the different regulation, but it's also, I think, a different cultural and language step. And I think a lot of companies still need to remind themselves that it's not just a bigger, China's not a bigger Hong Kong, it's just really a different market. So I think that there are opportunities, and I think Hong Kong can be is a key area in the Greater Bay Area. But I think when you step into China, you really need to be well prepared.
I guess, Robert, just thinking aloud, one of the areas we haven't touched on that is very much an area of importance for the next probably 10 years of Greater Bay integration is the infrastructure area, because there will be a major drive to build transport and communications infrastructure between the designated cities within the Greater Bay Area. And there's a lot of that, those project works. So not only in terms of traditional core infrastructure businesses, but also businesses that support or feed into that, which could include technology, but includes an awful lot of other things also. This is would be a good time to be here.
Yeah, and I think there have been many people think about infrastructure, building bridges, airports, and a lot of these things have already been done. But I think the technology infrastructure, right, is as important, specifically for the next step of China's development. Yes, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure has been built, but I think all these incentives are now there to build the digital infrastructure. And that will be, I think, as you said, like this will be a great chance for foreign businesses to enter into.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for all our panelists. So just to conclude, as mentioned right at the beginning, Hong Kong has certainly gone through a tough 18 months. But I, for one, am somebody that likes to seek the silver lining. I think we've highlighted some of the many positive Hong Kong and the Greater Bay has to offer to its domestic as well as international business communities. As Robert pointed out, China, being one of the global powerhouses, has put in place several measures to open up its economy to promote foreign investments. For foreign companies to do so, Hong Kong still serves as an ideal point of entry with its robust English common law system and top-tier business infrastructures. Also, the implementation of policies and the provision of financial support to specific industries by the Hong Kong government is testament to its commitment to fulfill its key objectives for the Greater Bay Area, as Patrick stated. And contrary to popular belief, the national security laws may only impact about 5% of the business sector. Dealing with cross-border commercial disputes is a nightmare and extremely expensive, and even more so when it comes to China. And with the mutual recognition of enforcements of judgments Monica discussed, doing business in China through Hong Kong have become slightly easier. As Mark illustrated, the Trump administration's decision to ban Chinese companies from listing in the US for not complying with US accounting standards may very well create more opportunities for Hong Kong's capital markets. So when one door closes, another one opens. And lastly, doing business in China remains tricky, which is why we are here to guide you through the challenges and pitfalls. So thank you everybody for attending our webinar, and a special thank you to each of our panelists for their contributions today.
Thank you very much, Marcel.
Thanks, Marcel. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.